I forgot to start the recording. Thank you, Lord, for reminding me. All right. Here we go. Let me just double check. Okay, we're good. Okay, so when you think of the word Arab, one of the things that comes to your mind is, say it again. Yeah, because the Muslim faith, roots their belief system in Ishmael as the firstborn, the true firstborn. Mm-hmm. Who else in the Bible besides Ishmael would be associated with what is today the Arab world? Right, yeah, there are three groups that really comprise what is today the country of Jordan. And those three would be Moab, and what are the other two? Pardon? Ammon and? What other major player in the early line of Abraham would represent the Arab world? Yeah, but and the father of Edom, Esau, right? So there's an interesting combination. It's not just the descendants of Ishmael, but even descendants of Isaac through Esau are part of the Arab world. And so there are lots and lots of Arabs who are descendants of Abraham. In fact, they would all call themselves, descendants of Abraham. And of course, that branches out. What else comes to your mind? Word Arab. A hot climate, okay. Yeah. Most of the Arab countries are, all of them would be hot climates. Good. What else? Aladdin and some others, Mulan, I haven't seen a lot of, movies published in the last few decades have had Muslim themes. Any idea as to why that is? I mean, you could ask why not, but mm-hmm. Okay. Yeah, okay, the desire to be diverse. And when that comes to Islam, what is especially true? When you think about the desire to become more diverse, how does that pertain to Islam in particular? Well, okay, yes, but that's looking at it from their end. What about looking at it from our end, our culture, wanting to be more inclusive that way? What would be the agenda when it comes to Islam? It's a good thing I'm thinking of here. Okay, appeal to an Islamic audience, yes. And what about what we say to the non-Islamic audience in our country? Yeah. Mm-hmm. Right. Yes. There's been a push, and I think in a good sense, to help our culture understand that the word Islam is not synonymous with terrorism. because, like it or not, that's the image that was portrayed as a result of 9/11. Yeah. And so a lot of people in the Western world were awakened to Islam and what it stands for as a result of 9/11, which obviously biases you from the very beginning, right? And so there has been a concerted effort to remove a stigma that's not fair that we have placed. And most people who have that stigma have it just because that's what we were, excuse the pun, bombarded with, as a result of 9/11 and those things that came about. The whole war, the Gulf War and Desert Storm and all that, those all relate to an Arab culture. Now, one thing it's in the notes, but I'll just say this because it bears saying twice. Be very careful that you don't use the words Muslim and Arab interchangeably, okay? Not all Muslims, he said 93% of Arabs are Muslim, but not all are, and not all Muslims are Arab. In fact, what country in the world has the greatest population of Muslims? I mentioned it last week. Indonesia. Yeah. So when we talk about the Arab cluster here, we're not talking about the Muslim culture synonymously. Yes, most of the people who pertain to these will be Muslim in their orientation, but we're not dealing with a Muslim cluster. It is an Arabic cluster, all right? It's kind of like them looking at us and saying, oh, West, Christian, right? The Western world is synonymous with the Christian world. Well, we know it's not. And so we want to do the same service to them by saying we realize that not everybody is one or the other, it's both and. Okay, so your first blank, you already got it. For many Americans, the Arab culture is the most unfamiliar one. When I was growing up, there was this word Muslim, M-O-S-L-E-M, and I didn't even know what it was, okay? The only reason that I started understanding something about the Muslim people, which now we call Muslims, same thing, but it's just, it's a different way of spelling it now, is because I enjoyed watching basketball. I enjoyed watching NBA games. And when I was growing up, a lot of the players in the NBA were turning to Islam. And my favorite of all was a guy whose name was Lou Alcindor when he played for UCLA. You ever hear of that name? Lou Alcindor? Well, have you ever heard the name Kareem Abdul-Jabbar? Same guy. He adopted the Muslim faith and he changed his name from Lou Alcindor to Kareem Abdul-Jabbar. And a lot of that was happening. You ever hear of a guy named Cassius Clay? Okay. How about Muhammad Ali? Same guy. He adopted the Muslim faith and became Muhammad Ali. And so that kind of thing was happening. Both those guys happened to be contemporaries of my youth. They were older than I was, but so now everybody knows about it, which is a good thing, but we also have to be careful. If I were to ask you this morning, if you had a chance to choose any one of these 10 clusters to visit this summer, say you had a chance, somebody say, here's $50,000, go somewhere and have a great time. I would be interested, and we won't do this, but I'd be interested in knowing what your pecking order is. Which ones would you go to first? Which one would you save until last? I'm guessing that a lot of people would probably put this one near the end. By the way, we're not putting it at the end here because it's the least desirable cluster. The order of these clusters really is just arbitrary. There's no priority in putting the Anglo culture first because we're the best, and the Arab cluster last because that's the worst. No, don't think that. Okay, I'm just following a guide that I came across. But a lot of people would wait on this one, and I think you guys are aware that fear, that stigma has passed to a large extent. Okay, and but so it's not as bad as it used to be. Okay, so here's our map, and there it is. And Again, the geography of the Arab cluster is the result of what? What historical reality? Pardon? Yeah, the Arab advance, which was stopped by the Battle of Tours in France, right? Charles Martel. And really, if God leads you to a place where there is a significant Arab population, it's really good for you to know some of that history, because that will show them you care about their past. So anyway, that's the Arab world. And just another picture to kind of highlight a little better for you. Last night in prayer band, we had the privilege of hearing from Kristen. And of course, she was right there in the UAE. What does UAE stand for? United Arab Emirates. And she explained that Emirates is kind of like states. So it's kind of like the United States of, and it was fascinating. She did a really good job. And by the way, I don't know if you knew this or not, but the United Arab Emirates airline is one of the highest ranked in all the world. Anybody ever flew on that one by chance? I've never had the privilege. Someday I would like to, but very, very. So this is what we're talking about. A little closer look. Some of these countries are obvious to you, all right? Which ones are the ones that we hear most about? Iraq, Syria, pardon? Yeah, okay, Saudi Arabia, yeah, Egypt. Yeah, those would probably be the ones when I was in college, or just Kuwait, the Gulf War was connected to that because the gas, the oil coming out of there. Yeah. Again, keep in mind that Egypt, Libya, and Algeria, if you're dealing with it from a purely geographical standpoint, pertain to what? Africa, right. But here we study sub-Saharan Africa as distinct from North Africa because of the Muslim domination in that. And again, I'm using Muslim here, and we're talking about the Arab cluster, but the fact that most of them are, so you'll find that sometimes I'll make that crossover between Arab and Muslim, and it's hard not to. But all right, so we don't know as much about Yemen and Oman, and there's the United Arab Emirates there. We all know about that now from Kristen going there. Bahrain, Qatar, even Cyprus is considered part of this region. Cyprus is kind of split in half. My daughter had a friend out at Iowa City who was studying. She's a Muslim, a Turkish Muslim. She's from Turkey, but she said that Cyprus is split in half between the Muslim faith and Eastern Orthodox. Interesting. So that's what we're looking at. Tunisia. Tunisia, we probably don't hear a lot about today, but remember, help me out. What was her name? The martyr we talk about from way back in the 2nd century? Yeah, she's slipping my mind. Famous martyr. She had a baby, and yeah, I do too. But I'm old. I have an excuse. You're tired. That's your excuse. What was it? Who was that? We studied her in Intro to Missions. Oh, that's terrible. Hey, when it comes to your mind, blurt it out for me, okay? All right. All right, let's talk about this. Let's begin with a few notable characteristics of Arab culture. It is more a cultural identity. Yes. Yes, perpetua. Yes, which means perpetual. It does. Yep. Yeah. Thank you. Yeah. I'll tell you, if you have to have a good memory for people's names and things to be a teacher, I'm out of here. I struggle sometimes. It's more of a cultural identity than an ethnic one. Okay. I never realized this, and I've not done extensive study in this area, but there was a time just after the Muslim advance, North Africa and so on, where the Arab world was at its height. It boasted incredibly huge and sophisticated libraries, the dress, the economy, everything. I mean, it was on a wave, the crest of a wave during that time. And then the Crusades happened as a response to the Muslim advance, and a lot of that was lost. But for a long time, the Arab world, especially after the Muslim advance, was a highly sophisticated place to live, very advanced. And so it became more of a cultural thing than a merely ethnic thing. The dominant language, Arabic. Now, do we have any relationship to Arabic in English? Yeah. We call our numerals Arabic numerals. Isn't that interesting? Yeah. Arab and speaking Arabic are usually synonymous. And like a lot of languages, the Quran, for example, was written in what they would call classic or classical Arabic. And so, street Arabic is not considered sufficient. In fact, to translate the Quran even from classical Arabic to more modern Arabic is considered blasphemy. You don't do that. You have to know classical Arabic in order to, and I don't understand the differences between the two or how similar they are, but Arabic. I love it's a beautiful language. I mean, it's calligraphic. Anybody here into calligraphy, it's one of the most beautiful languages to write. I love it. 60% of the world's oil is there, okay? That ought to draw your attention. That's good fuel for discussion. And a lot of people thought that by now oil wouldn't be as big of a deal, but it still is. What country was it that just passed a law, or was it a state, that within the next 20 years, all automobiles have to be electric? Of course. Why was I even thinking? Now, I don't know if that actually is a law. I think it's something they're discussing. Yeah. A lot of people thought that by now oil would no longer be an issue, but all appearances are that oil is going to be an issue for a long, long time. In fact, it'll probably be an issue right until the end, because so many things depend, not just fuel for cars, but I mean, think of airplanes, think of all the other things that burn petroleum, and think about the lubricants and all that. I mean, there's so much. It's going to be a big deal for a long time. Modern cities mingle among ancient ones. There's an effort to, at least among some of them, to preserve history and old artifacts. Arabs are vibrant people with a strong sense of loyalty for family and close friends. I mean, family is key. They're very, very communal people in that sense. The collectivistic mentality is very strong. And if you're part of the family, you are. And that's one of the reasons why it is so difficult to win an Arab individual to Christ. I mean, God can do anything, and he does. But if you're ministering in an Arab country or culture, then I would encourage you, as you are able, as God gives you opportunity, to minister to work with an entire family of people when you're sharing Christ. There's a lot of discussion out there because, as you know, that isn't limited to the Arab world. There are lots of cultures that are tribal cultures, animistic cultures, where the family is very, very tight. But family is very, very important. So let's talk about the Arab family a little bit, okay? And by the way, not all Arab ladies, for example, wear the same thing, and not all head coverings mean the same thing. If you're going to minister in that part of the world, it's probably worth your while to get online or find out from somebody what different head coverings mean. The styles, the colors, the designs, they all say something a little bit differently. And that varies from country to country as well. Okay? Now notice that the younger guy is not wearing a head covering, but I'm assuming that's his father, the grandfather in the family. He is. So what does that mean? So those are, when it comes to dress, as one of you mentioned earlier, I think Liz, you talked about the dress. Yeah, this is one cluster where you really want to understand what dress communicates. Yep. So, honor and respect. And in the family, okay, and in the family, I think that and is added. Honor and respect in the family must be maintained at all costs. Yeah, I think there's a mistake there. Yeah. You hear about people, not just in this culture, but in Israel and other places, saying, if you convert to Christianity, you're dead to us. And that may signify literal physical killing, or it may signify being, forever dissociated. In fact, you're probably aware that even in the Bible, remember when God talked about somebody who would abandon Jehovah, what was the penalty for that in the law? What would happen to a person that abandoned Jehovah, went after other gods? It's repeated several times. Yeah, some translations say something like, that person shall be cut off from his people, right? Or her people. And there's debate even today as to what cut off means. Did that mean literal killing? Or did it mean somehow, shunned and treated as though he or she were dead? See, any of you taking Dr. Cole's Judges through Ruth or whatever class? Because today they talked about the daughter of Jephthah, he was telling me. But you don't mess with the family. That's the basic idea. You can mess with certain things in our culture, but don't you mess with our family. Arabs are patriarchal. The father is responsible for the family's well-being, and the children are loyal. And again, give me an example of another cluster we studied where that would also be true, or another country where patriarchal leadership is very, very strong. Confucian Asia. Yeah, remember the relationship between the father and the eldest son is key. Yeah. In the Indian culture as well, in India, patriarchal authority, very, very important. Yep. The larger the family, the better. Now, here's another mistake, a stereotype that we need to be careful not to make. You've probably heard it said that one of the ways that Islam is seeking to spread to the world is, bigger families, have lots and lots of kids. But we're making a mistake if we assume that every time you see a large Arab family, it's because they're trying to produce more Islam followers to take over the world, okay? Don't do that. Because the family is so important, and the unity and the role of the family is so important, for that matter alone, for that reason alone, having large families is considered a big deal, okay? So just a word of caution there, because you'll hear that say, in North Africa, one of the ways they're doing it, or they're having lots of babies in England, because they want to increase the population and take over the world that way. Well, that may be true to a degree, but that's not the only reason. So just anytime you hear something like that, always ask the question, is that exclusively true or not? Okay? Male offspring are more important. Sorry, ladies. A son can bring honor, but the daughter can bring shame. Now, again, there are lots of variants to that statement, okay? Don't view the Arab culture like you view Sparta, where everybody who's born, the father looks at him through the eyes. The baby comes out and the father sees that baby in a military uniform, from the very first hours of its life. No, don't do that, okay? But there are cases when a daughter can be considered, look, I've even committed that sin myself. My last name was Lounsbrough. How many Lounsbroughs are there in the world? Not very many. So, when a baby boy is, we have 7 grandkids. Only one of them is 2 of them are boys, but one of them is my daughter's son. So his last name is Gutierrez, right? Which is fine. I love the family, but where are the Lounsbroughs who are going to keep this thing going? I have one brother that's never been married, and my other brother has one son, and he's not married yet. So, it's funny. We went on it's totally random, but we went on my son Daniel and his fiancee Delaney's registry page for their wedding, and we found, when we've typed in Lounsbrough, how you type in the last name and it brings up whoever. We typed in Lounsbrough, and another couple that's getting married named Lounsbrough, the same exact spelling, in Wisconsin. And I told my wife, I said, we got to find out who that is. Get on Facebook. A name like Lounsbrough just doesn't pop up every day. So, I'm going to figure out who that is. So for me, I just like to see the Lounsbrough name go on a few more years, but it may just fizzle. All right. The family and business are often integrated. That's something that's quite foreign to the American way of life. It used to be more of that. The old idea of the son becoming the apprentice of his father and taking over the family business. That still happens to some degree on farms today. One of the sons ends up staying behind. My wife's grandparents had 6 children, and 5 of them ended up in ministry. 4 of them went to Brazil. One of them ended up on staff at what is now Calvary University, and the youngest son is the one that stayed on the farm. And I remember sometimes he has expressed over the years kind of like he's maybe not as important as the other ones because they all went out into ministry, and he's the guy that stayed back at home on the farm. And it wasn't because anybody tried to make him feel that way. He just felt that tendency inside, but his siblings would reinforce to him the idea, look, you are very important. I mean, you're faithful in your church. You provide a place for us to come back to the farm to when we come home on furlough and all that. I'm just saying that we live in a culture that doesn't prize the connection, like some cultures do. And that's true in the Arab world. Okay. Number 3, Arab fashion. Now, talk about dress. Don't get the idea that everybody, wears, dark clothing with headdresses. This is probably an event, okay, of some sort, and I don't know what, but that's my first guess, okay? Arabs like expensive brands. They really enjoy buying expensive brands. So, fellas, if you marry an Arab gal, get the nicer perfumes. But gals, guess what? The men also like the expensive colognes. Yeah, that's true on both. It's not just a male or female thing. They enjoy using rich cologne. I won't ask you who likes to get the rich. My mom loved Estee Lauder. Anybody Estee Lauder? I'm gonna get personal now with you. Yep. So when we got her perfume, it was Estee Lauder. Are they still around? That brand still exists? Okay. But it was good for us to know that. She wasn't Arab. But in many cases, Western and traditional practice can be mixed. All right. Look, as we've said so many times in this class, globalization is going to have its impact. There is a certain neutralizing impact on virtually every country in the world. I mean, there are always going to be some people groups that are tucked back away that are sheltered from the impact of globalization, but those are few and far between. Yep. All right. And, depending on if you're in Saudi Arabia, this is going to have a much lesser impact. Okay? But if you're in Thailand, well, that's Buddhism. There's Islam in Thailand as well. Well, okay, Kristen talked about being in Abu Dhabi there. And she said she compared it to Las Vegas, Dubai. She compared the city of Dubai to Las Vegas because it attracts people from all over the place. Very, very much more Western. You probably couldn't transplant Dubai to Saudi Arabia. Probably just wouldn't work. But interesting. A plain white headdress means that you haven't done Hajj yet. Now, what's Hajj? You all know what it is, even if you don't know it by this name. What's the ultimate goal of every practicing Muslim? Yeah, the pilgrimage to Mecca, right. And there are certain permissions for those who are not able to go that are considered legitimate. If health and economic, if a person is unable to, it's not like, okay, you're condemned to hell forever. You can't ever be a good Muslim. So there are some leniences there. But if you have not done your pilgrimage yet, you will wear a plain white headdress. It's not a curse. They're not putting you down, but it is a statement that you're still working on that. Okay? If I were to ask you today, how much of what you wear, the way you dress, how much does it communicate who you are? I mean, does the dress code, the average dress code in America, say very much about who we are? Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, for example, in a bank, my daughter-in-law worked at a bank for a while, and she wasn't allowed to wear open-toed shoes. She worked at Wells Fargo. And there were certain things. But even that wasn't, how do I say this? It didn't communicate anything about her religion or her lifestyle in general. That was something unique to Wells Fargo, right? Whereas in this culture, the statement is much broader about who you are as an Arab citizen. Does that make sense? Yeah. Okay. Good. Women's dress is more varied than men's. And again, if we're looking at Western men and women, I would say that we all dress pretty equally varied. You got your jeans, you got your casual, even on casual day here, there's quite a variety. And if we say business casual, men and women alike have quite a varying. But in the Arab culture, it's the women that are the more, how do I say, they live for that more, the variance. I don't know what this means. Okay. The most traditional dress is in Saudi Arabia. Remember the tight versus loose. Saudi Arabia being a very tight culture. Jordan is more contemporary. A lot more freedom. Just to give you guys something to think about, how many of you studied Daniel with Dr. Cole? Some of you had Daniel class? Okay. I don't know if you remember this. When you get to Daniel chapter 11, and Daniel is talking about the advance of the man of sin, we call Antichrist, and there's quite a bit of detail in chapter 11 about his advances in the future and all that. But there's a verse there in chapter 11 that says, but he will not be able to overcome the inhabitants of Edom, Ammon, and Moab. Those three that we mentioned earlier. What country, well, here it is, whole purpose for saying it. Jordan today, by and large, not exactly, but by and large, is the modern version of Edom, Moab, and Ammon. And for whatever reason, the Antichrist will not be able to overcome Jordan. And if you look at the country of Jordan today, it is somewhat unique, not only in its styles, but even in its relationship to Israel. and the United States. It has a much more amicable relationship with Israel and the U.S. than other Arab countries. I'm not saying they're good buddies. I'm just saying it's different. So when you look at that and you look at the eschatology in Daniel 11, it is fascinating. And when Israel flees, when the Antichrist breaks his covenant in the middle of the tribulation after 3.5 years, where do they flee? Israelites are going to have to flee because the Antichrist is going to go after them hot and heavy. Where do they flee? The mountains. Okay, and many suspect that those are the mountains of Jordan across the other side, and perhaps even specifically in the area known as Petra in the Old Testament, where all the rocks are and so forth, and that there will be places there. In fact, I don't know if this is still happening, but there was even a time when people would talk about different Christian organizations placing imperishable food items in some of the rocks in the area that was Petra in Jordan in preparation for what they believe will be a fulfillment of that prophecy, going specifically to that area. So there's something about Jordan that stands out differently from other Arab nations as it relates to end times. More contemporary there. Some Arab women feel freer by using head covers. See, we Westerners tend to look at a woman that wears a head covering as being restricted. You know, she has to do this, you know. But if you're a practicing Muslim or even, just an Arab woman, there's a certain sense in which you actually may feel more free by having a head covering. Why? Where does freedom tie into this, to a head covering? And ladies, you'd be better at answering this than the men would. It's protective of okay. While you're thinking of it, yeah, the protection, rather than protective being a suffocating feeling, it's the covering gives them more of a feeling of security. Very interesting. Yeah, Sharon? Of being what? Yeah. When Arab women look at the West, and the women in the West, and I'm not saying women, but you know, what's on in Hollywood and what's, you know, on TV, they view them as slaves, as sex slaves. And let's face it, to some degree they have a point, right? In some contexts. And so they view themselves as actually free to be the woman that they were intended to be, preserving themselves for their husband and not being subject to the looks of other men, which can be a very scary thing for them. So it's interesting. Did you think of the other thing or not? Okay, if you do, that makes sense. It's the girl that my daughter knew from Turkey. She came to our house for a visit one day. And of course, she had her hair up. She had a covering over her hair. And then she said that she would like to show her hair to my wife and my daughter, Sarah. And so, of course, I'm the man, so I stayed downstairs. They went up. This is the house we lived in previously. They went upstairs to a bedroom there, and they closed the door, and she took off her head covering and let her hair flow. It was, you know, really long. And it was beautiful. My wife and daughter's hair was just beautiful. And she was proud of her hair, and she was proud to show it to them. But she would never do that in my presence. See, in our culture, you know, ladies, there's nothing wrong with you making your hair look nice to go to a public event or even to class or to church, right? It's not considered, you take pride in that, and you're okay with men appreciating the fact that you have beautiful hair. See, it's not an issue in the Western world, but it is in the Arab world. It's fascinating. Questions about that, comments? Interesting to think about. All right. For some women, walking outside the house with the head uncovered, excuse this, is like asking a Westerner to walk outside in underclothing. You know, some of us have dreams of that happening. You ever dream of that? They say that people that stand up front a lot, so you guys are going to be teachers, say that people that stand up front a lot dream those kinds of dreams more, where they're standing up and all of a sudden they realize they didn't get dressed, or they're only half dressed. And that's kind of the feeling. So I've never done that, but I've had those dreams. So that helps me to understand how a woman in an Arab world would feel if she had to go out in public and let the wind blew her head covering off, or somebody took it off, or whatever. Be very. The hair is the crown of a woman's beauty. And in the Arab world, you reserve that beauty for the man in your life, your husband, not for society in general. Yeah, Emma? Yeah, and that's a really good question, because I'm sure that one feeds the other somehow. They're not mutually exclusive. And which one feeds which, I don't know. I can't go back far enough in history to answer that question for you, but that is a very good question. Which is the chicken and which is the egg? I'm not sure. We know how old the Muslim religion is, right? It started when, approximately? When was the vision of the angel Gabriel, as the story goes, to Muhammad? It was around 620 AD. Okay, so, if you could trace the Arab culture back farther, what did the dress code look like? Was that already I'm sure it was, because even in the Old Testament, the women wore, so it definitely precedes the Muslim faith, Emma, to answer that question. But the Muslim faith has had its impact on styles, like the Hajj thing, that would obviously be a result of the Muslim influence. Yep. All right. Number 4, Arabs are very resourceful, although they are more being than doing. They're more of a being culture, but they are very resourceful. They value what they have and how it's used. That's a good thing. Are the terms Arab and Islam synonymous? And we've already touched on that, but let me just make a few comments. No, there are even Arab Jews. Have you ever heard of an Arab Jew? Or a Jewish Arab, a Jewish Muslim? Yeah, not a Jewish Arab, that would be two ethnicities, but a Jewish Muslim would be an ethnic Jew who is a religious Muslim, or an Arab Jew is an ethnic Arab who adopts Judaism. So we're not talking about mixing ethnicities, we're talking about an ethnicity and a religion. Remember, we don't get into this in this class, but the word Jew can be understood as a religious term or an ethnic term. Just keep that in mind. That's why Dr. Craig Hartman, who's been here before, he prefers the word Jewish when you're referring to the ethnicity, and Jew probably more when you're referring to the religion. But that's a little different. And Arabs only make up 15% of Islam. Now, okay, there you go. You were saying that 93%, Grayson, what you found, 93% of Muslims this says only 15% of Arabs. Thank you. Online students, you didn't hear that, but she got it right. Okay. Yeah, the statement is correct. Yeah. I just couldn't spit it out. I'm ready for summer break too, you guys. All right. Yeah, because for instance, you go to Indonesia, which is not primarily Arab, and yet you have the largest population of Muslims in the world. Islam is dominant. There you go. And shapes daily life more than most clusters. And even if you live in the Arab cluster, even if you're a Christian, you are going to be impacted by the Muslim, standard of dress and other. And one of the big questions that comes up is, if I'm a Christian in this part of the world, is it okay for me to wear head coverings, or by doing so, am I expressing myself as a Muslim? And the answer is technically no, you're not, because it is an Arab custom before it's an Islamic custom. That makes sense? So and if you don't, ladies, wear a hair covering in this part of the world, then you're going to open up some pretty significant challenges. Yeah. So don't think that, if you wear a head covering, you're automatically selling yourself as a Muslim. You're not doing that. You're not portraying that at all. If you wear a certain type of head covering, then yes, you might be. So, I didn't ask, but has anybody here, besides Kristen, anybody here been to the Arab cluster? Yeah, I haven't either. I've been to Israel, but that's, what cluster is Israel placed in, at least in our study? Geographically, it's right there by the Arab world, but where do we place Israel? Yeah, Latin European, because of its influence on the Mediterranean and the Mediterranean world. The 5 pillars of Islam. Okay, who can name any of them? What's a pillar of Islam? What? I got him in there? Oh, stupid professor. All right. Shaddai, yeah, there's no God but Allah, and Muhammad is his prophet. Salat is prayers, and that can be the daily prayers, 5 times a day or whatever, always facing toward Mecca. The zakat is the purification, which is almsgiving as a way of actually obtaining a purified spirit, purified life by giving alms. Saum is fasting. It's a big deal right around Ramadan, but also at other times. And the Hajj, which is the pilgrimage. And so if you're going to live in that part of the world, it's good to know. Now, some Arabs, and chiefly some Muslims, chiefly Shiite Muslims, would like to add a 6th, not all of them, but some of them would like to add a 6th pillar of Islam. And you guess what that 6th one might be? Yeah, they would, because the Shiite Muslims interpret the word jihad in the Quran as military aggression, military conquest, whereas your Sunni Muslims, and again, these are generalizations, the Sunni Muslims, a much larger percentage, like 80% of them are Sunnis, view the jihad as the personal struggle, to become what I should become. And so some of your Shiite Muslims would say they should add jihad as, if you're going to be a true Muslim, you have to believe in world conquest for Allah. Okay? Again, not all of them, but some. All right, so jihad, speaking of which, it refers to the struggle against pride and idolatry, and can include the enemy depending on one's interpretation of the Qur'an. So if you're Shiite, that can include the enemy, military advance. If you're Sunni, probably not. Although, now remember, Saddam Hussein was Sunni. But in his case, being Sunni or Shiite didn't change what he was after. He, in other words, what he did not do primarily because he was a Sunni Muslim, but primarily because he was a dictator in Iraq. So there's, when I first heard he was a Sunni, I thought, no way. After all he did, he's got to be a Shiite. But there was more to Saddam Hussein than just that. By the way, if you want a really, really interesting book to read this summer, read a book called Saddam's Secrets. It's written by a guy named Georgi Vada, and he was a Daniel in the inner court of Saddam Hussein during the era of his reign. Fascinating testimony of how God used him, the only Christian. I wish I had more. We talk about it, non-Christian religions. But Georgi Sada, S-A-D-A, Georgi Sada, he was a Daniel, and wow, it's an amazing book. Saddam's Secrets. Commend that to you. B, most Arabs do not see themselves as enemies of the West. Now that may surprise some Westerners, although not so much now. After 9/11, in the wake of 9/11, yeah, maybe so. But actually, in fact, yeah, many of them, are very, very supportive of the West and very friendly. Well, differences between the West and Arabs. So here's a little true and false quiz for you. Let's see where we are here. How are we doing? Oh, we're doing fine. Differences between the West and Arabs. A, it is not uncommon for Arab men to walk hand in hand in public. True or false? Who said that? Yeah, it's true. See, you and I see two men walking hand in hand in public in our culture. And that's not just true in the Arab cluster, but in the African cluster, it's very common for men, African men, to hold hands when they walk together. In fact, if you're a man and you go there, you're walking with a pastor, he might just grab your hand and hold it like this and walk with you. And you might think, oh, and everybody thinks, oh, these are good friends. To do that here, very different. So those are things to be aware of. In the Latin American world, men don't typically walk hand in hand together, but there's a lot more hand-to-hand contact beyond just a handshake. So, yeah. So that's true. Before commencing a business meeting in the Middle East, it's customary to engage in some initial small talk. True or false? Man, you're doing well. 2 for 2. You got it. It's true. Remember, in the West, now again, my stereotype, most Westerners would even do something like that, but it's an offense. The difference is, in the West, if you sat down and got right down to business, if you said, hey, okay, look, we got a time limit here, we need to get right down to the point. Nobody's going to be offended. You do that in the Arab world, and you create a barrier. And so you always begin by acknowledging the person, talking about the family or other things to show that you're not just there to get something out of that person, but you're there because you're interested in the well-being of the person. Yeah. All right, good. Letter C, Arab business people emphasize written agreements. True or false? False. They do construct written agreements, but remember when we talked about particularism and universalism? Particularism says those rules can change. Even though you sign your name at the bottom, everybody understands in that culture that circumstances may change, somebody might die, there might be a financial crisis or whatever, and therefore we can modify it. Oh, but even after we signed it? Even after you've signed it, okay? In our culture, we would probably say we need to reformat this and sign the edited version to make it legit. See? And that's not all bad either, okay? Because you don't want the thing so loose-ended that your signature means nothing, right? But so the spoken word is more important. The deal is only done when the parties have gone their way. Yeah. Again, globalization does impact that. When the United States makes an agreement of some sort with somebody in the Arab cluster, it's going to be signed, and that's going to be binding, and so it's not always consistent. All right, well, you have this also in your notes, and so I just thought this was interesting. Anything on there that strikes you funny or, that seems unusual, or they all make pretty good sense? Yeah. Is that true? Did you see that? Yeah. Part of that, I think, Abby, is because In the West, when you grow up, you get 18, you leave the home, you can do whatever you want. So you lose that vital connection with your family, and you begin to enter into the work world, your profession or whatever, and therefore your colleagues, your friends, become equally, if not more important than your immediate family, because now your livelihood depends on them. Yeah, I think that's the idea there. Whereas in the Arab world, even after you're off and you have your career and everything, the family structure is still going to be there and be important. Yeah. Any others look interesting to you or unusual? Now, little significance when it comes honor and shame, again, that's probably a little bit unfair, because even in the Western world, most bosses, for example, not always, but most bosses will try to avoid embarrassing you or putting you to shame in front of everybody if there's something to deal with, okay? So this isn't intended to present the West as cold and unfeeling, but by comparison, that would be true. All right, let's end with some do's and don'ts. Yeah, one of the reasons I put that there is I have asked people where coffee came from. Maybe Mr. Stearns has the answer to this question. I don't know. I've heard some answer that, say, in the Arabic world is where the coffee originally came from. Anybody else got an opinion on that, you coffee connoisseurs? Or don't we have any coffee connoisseurs here? I don't know. I've often wondered where that comes from, because coffee grows so many places in the world. But I have heard some say that, one of its roots was in the Arabic world. Do respect cultural norms regarding men and women. Very, very important, especially in public. If you're walking in the Arab cluster, with few exceptions, you're walking down a busy street, and men, we pass a woman on the street, we don't look at her. You keep looking ahead, because to make eye contact with a strange, unfamiliar woman would be considered offensive. I think so. I think it goes both ways. I think so. Right. Yes. I've heard that too. So if you're from Iowa, where everybody's friendly, right? Hi, you even see that here in the States. You go to the Northeast, you walk down the street, hi, say, who are you? Do I know you? but how much more and that's not a question of fairness. It's a question of respect. Do keep in mind that most Muslims won't eat pork or drink alcohol. I was certified with the Cultural Intelligence Center back in 2014 or 15 in Chicago. And after one of the sessions, we all went out to a really nice restaurant there in downtown Chicago. And I sat across the table from an Arab Muslim. And we were talking, because I told him I was a Christian, and we discovered quickly that we had a couple things in common as it related to pork and alcohol. And I don't know where you are in alcohol. I'm an abstainer by conviction, but I understand that there are arguments that don't seal the deal completely in the Bible. But in general, he was very, very specific about pork and alcoholic beverages, part of their purification rites. Don't use your left hand. Now, if you do, you haven't committed the unpardonable sin, okay? And we talked about this in relation to India as well. They know you're a Westerner. They know you're gonna, you do things differently, okay? But I think I may have mentioned that David Livermore, before he goes to the Arab cluster, he actually spends a couple of weeks ahead practicing not using his left hand for social things, so that when he gets there, at least he's a little bit more mentally prepared for that. Interesting. It's reserved for personal hygiene. Now remember, if you're eating at a French table, you'll have a knife in one hand, a fork in the other, and they both stay up above the table, right? So you definitely use both hands, but not in the Arab world. All right, and then finally, do visit this part of the world. And, he mentions that. I got this from David Livermore as well. He mentions this because of the reticence that some people have toward visiting an Arab world. Some people are just afraid, what if? And he says, just relax. It's not, just like anywhere in the world, you have to be careful where you go, okay? In the United States, if somebody came to visit from overseas, you would probably tell them, avoid XYZ, because it's not real safe there right now. When we had our sunrise breakfast at church, I sat across the table from a couple that just came from Seattle, Washington, and they said there are 300 police in Seattle. And Seattle as a city is becoming more and more like a homeless shelter every day. So, if somebody's coming to the States, I probably wouldn't encourage them to make Seattle their first stop. So, visit. There are lots of places in the Arab world that are lovely. Do talk to Kristen too. She's spent a lot of time over there, and Johanna was with her, and so it's a great experience. I hope to get there someday myself. We'll see. All right. Questions, comments, objections? Okay. See you on Thursday.